Mr. Speaker, members, what this amendment to the amendment does is strike the last 4 lines of my initial amendment. So I'd like to talk about what those top 8 lines will do once this amendment is amended. Members, we have seen that there has been an increase in public demonstrations, particularly public demonstrations that do end up resulting in someone, whether law enforcement or a civilian, being injured. In fact, we had such a scenario happen right outside these doors a few weeks ago, where a public demonstration ended up in an arrest and significant injury to a member of the public who was just here to be heard. Public protest is an incredibly fundamental right in the United States, and it's something that we need to make sure can occur safely, and safely for everyone involved. So what my amendment does is it adds to the type of policies that TCOL will be responsible for developing model policies on and ensuring that law enforcement agencies have adequate policies on. It adds civil, it adds public protests, and it adds situations of crowd control, because we want our law enforcement officers to be prepared to handle those situations well. It also takes the requirement for a use of force policy and divides that use of force policy, or clarifies that that use of force policy needs to include both lethal force and less lethal force. And I want to take y'all back in time a couple years to talk about a time where this policy would have greatly served the civilians of Texas, as well as law enforcement officers who were trying to respond to a public protest. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, there were demonstrations around the state, including right here in Austin. And at the demonstrations here in Austin, some of my constituents were present. Law enforcement officers were issued less lethal arms. Those were beanbag rounds that were expired. A beanbag round is designed to be relatively soft and ideally not cause permanent damage. They also are designed to be fired in ways where they hit people at their center of mass or below. Because the less lethal munitions used during those protests over a few days were expired, they were hard, they caused more damage upon impact, and the officers firing those weapons also could not control the height at which those rounds struck demonstrators. And what happened is they didn't just strike demonstrators, they struck people there watching. Many of y'all saw the video of a 17-year-old young man by himself on the grassy embankment on the side of I-35, struck in the head seemingly out of nowhere, clearly causing no danger to anyone else. That young man was not my constituent, but another of my constituents, Justin Howell, was also struck in the head. Austin Police Department publicly acknowledged they did not intend to hit him. They have since entered into a multi-million-dollar settlement with his family, but Justin has brain damage, and his life has been forever altered because the City of Austin Police Department did not have adequate policies in place to make sure that they didn't issue their officers expired munitions. Another one of my constituents also was inadvertently struck in the jaw and had to have his entire jaw reconstructed. That young man's name is Anthony Evans. There are at least 3 young men who had their lives altered forever because the City of Austin Police Department did not have adequate policies in place to make sure that those officers were not issued expired beanbag rounds. In addition, the other people whose lives were changed forever that day are those officers who never should have been issued those rounds. I know this body is very aware of the ongoing conversations around whether or not those officers or their leadership is responsible for those mistakes. So what my amendment simply does is it clarifies that the use of force policies that TCOL is already responsible for putting together will include both lethal and less lethal force to make sure those policies are in place for things like less lethal munitions, tasers, tear gas, etc., making sure we have good, solid policies. And then also adding to the list of policies that TCOL oversees, policies for crowd control and for responding to a public protest. Members, this is common sense. This is things all of our law enforcement officers will be safer if these policies are in place. And they are things that will keep your constituents who show up to make their voices heard safer.